So the panel will actually commence with a short presentation from Daniel, and then we'll jump into the discussion with our panelists. And I'd like to remind everyone that we are very happy to take questions from the audience, so I'll make sure to allocate some time during the latter part of the session. Daniel.
Thank you. So when I was 6 years old, my mother asked me, "Son, what do you want to become when you're old?" And I said, "Mom, I want to be a shrimp farmer in Indianapolis, Indiana, because I'm Mexican, so that's..." So jokes aside, when I was 22, I had my first interaction with the food reality on the ground. Because of a natural disaster in 2005, Hurricane Stan devastated the coastal communities of Oaxaca and Chiapas. And with some friends, we organized emergency aid to distributing among these communities. And then I became obsessed with the long-term economic viability of these non-commercial, subsistence-based fishing communities. So 18 years later, I'm here. And so we know that our food system is broken. And we know that because we feel weird about eating. It evokes sometimes feeling of shame, guilt, fear, and we need a solution. I think that our generation has no choice but to fix our food system. But first we need to ask, what do we want? And I think that we need to focus on whole foods and nutrition. But also we need to consider food production in relationship to, one, local economic integration, second, local cultural and culinary significance. But also we need to rethink food production in relationship to the environment, and not only with the aim of reducing impact, but also bringing back food production into the natural cycle of life. Technology should have a role. But over the past decade, we wasted precious time, resources, and focus on more processed food. I'm thinking about plant-based substitutes and lab-grown stuff that, on the one hand, is only appealing for probably a single-digit market share, and on the other hand, hasn't produced a single commercial product. So I don't think we can bet the future of our planet and the future of our food system into these technologies or these products. My name is Daniel Rusek. I'm the founder and CEO of Atarraya, where we're building the most sustainable animal protein industry in our generation. It's basically sustainable and local shrimp farming anywhere in the world. So shrimp represents very good our food system in basically how we get it. You can only get shrimp from two sources, wild catch and farming. Wild catch relies on devastating the ocean, the seabed, in order to take shrimp. Shrimp, they don't swim, they basically walk. So in order to get them, you basically need to scrape the bottom of the ocean on a scale that is 2 million square kilometers a year. And then you have farming. Farming relies on polluting the oceans for business. You need to basically get a urban scale amounts of water every day. But it also represents a great opportunity, because shrimp is also very good at turning resources into high-valued protein. Shrimp grows 10,000 times their size in just 4 months. A shrimp female lays 150,000 eggs every 6 weeks, and they convert plant-based protein into animal protein almost on a one-to-one basis. So why technology hasn't solved this issue? Well, it's basically because shrimp is very hard to farm. And also because shrimp farming is done in basically in developing countries like Mexico, Ecuador, or India. So not a big tech scene there. But the opportunity is great. 95% of the shrimp that is consumed in America comes from abroad. It's imported. So, and we are not the first ones to localize, to identify this opportunity. But past experiences have failed because they basically bet on the wrong technology. They needed experts on site. Their final product was cost prohibitively, and even public companies went bankrupt even before opening their farms. At Atarraya, we did 3 unique things. First, we replicated the ocean biochemistry in a controlled environment. Second, we packaged our technology and we put it into a hyper-modular solution that is built for scaling and replication. And third, we improved upon the quality of the final product. So our product has better texture, it has no antibiotics, no pesticides, and no preservatives. We call our technology Shrimp Box, and it's based on the specifications of a shipping container, and these are basically farms that can be put anywhere in the world. So we can farm shrimp in different environments, in the desert, in cold environments, and we don't discharge any water. We also have an unconditional open door policy, and we have one simple mantra: no waste. We produce, with the excess biomass that we produce, we create biogas, and we also create organic fertilization that can be used in regenerative agriculture protocols. Our technology is based on the natural cycle of life. It's basically a nitrogen recycling system that converts feed protein into ammonia that is then turned into a microbial community that is constantly improving the water quality, just like in the oceans. So for the first time, our ability to enjoy fresh shrimp is not dictated by our proximity to the ocean. We farm a premium product that we can offer at an affordable price. Some of the best chefs in the United States are already using our shrimp. We have a farmer's wait list that cannot wait to basically produce a product that their local community crave. And they will basically have a profitable business while feeling good about it. And I think that this is how we change our food system. Thank you.
So perhaps I'd like to start the conversation following from some of the points that Daniel made about the food system being broken, the rethinking of food production, and in light of the different sort of structural forces at play. On one hand, we have this rapidly growing population, and on the other, we have the impact of climate change, which obviously affects arable land. So perhaps, Sharon, if I can start with you, looking at the food production side first, what are the problems with the current food system today?
So we have many, many challenges. And first, let me just open by saying that you cannot solve the climate crisis without solving the food crisis. Over about 1/3 of all emissions come from food production, obviously including agriculture. And we are doing some profoundly wrong things. I think we need all the tools in our toolbox. I don't think that we are in a position, for example, to say this method will not work. It's really about looking at the world, looking at the economic, local, climate, positions, like what's happening in that specific part of the world, and then adapting it with the many tools that we have in our toolbox. So definitely we have a growing population. We have a population that is moving to cities. We have a supply chain that doesn't really focus on transparency. We still have a lot of slavery, although that's not really necessarily on the food production side, but on the agriculture side. We are still, we're wasting 1/3 of all the food that we're producing, again, both on the ag side and on the food side. So I don't know if there's, the problems of food are in relation to what is happening to agriculture. I think we're eating, there was a study that I read on Nature, 40% of a lot of the nutrients that we're ingesting today are less than 50 years ago, so diminishing 40%. So When your mom used to say, drink that fresh squeezed orange juice that it's full of vitamin C, now it's basically sugar water. So we are also we're ingesting all the pollutants and the fertilizers and the chemicals that we put in our soil. Soil is desertification. It's a huge other problem. All of this is impacting the way food system is made, produced, and consumed.
I see. And thinking about the consumption side of food, what has this system created in terms of challenges on how consumers think about food and ultimately consume food?
Yeah, maybe a couple of things about, because I think the interesting thing is that we have the textbook solution, right? Indeed, we need to waste less. Probably in the Western world, we need to eat less. We need to cut a lot on meat. That probably frees up 40% of arable land. We can do more. We can do regenerative farming. Then sort of technologies like Daniel's, like mine, come in. You can do precision agriculture. You can do targeted gene editing, and sort of you solve the puzzle, right? So I think that textbook answer is there. What I have learned in the past 5 years working with Meatball is that food is so cultural, and that's why it's so slow to change patterns. Because I think that's in the end where the biggest bang for the buck is. But on the other hand, that's the one that's so difficult, and partly that's because we just crave food and it's cultural and we like our food, and part of it is that for a lot of people, cheap food is a priority.
I see. And in terms of the kind of pure health impacts that we are seeing on populations as a consequence of this food system, Sourav?
Sure. Just to introduce myself, I come from a smallholding farming family in India, and I'm also a healthcare expert. So we obviously eat food to be healthy and to sustain. So we really can't take out health from the entire equation when we're talking about AgTech. That should be the central pillar around which we need to build AgTech, essentially. That's my view. Now, none of the countries in the world are on track to contain obesity in men and women. I think about 18% women and slightly less men are obese around the world. Essentially, 1/3 of the world's population is obese, and this is not necessarily due to overconsumption, because of also malnutrition. So we are essentially ingesting food or having food which is depleted in its nutritive values. That's a huge element of where we are going wrong, as Sharon was pointing out. Alongside that, where we are also lagging or in our understanding is that we can't really go with a spade and try and fit the one-size-fits-all around the world. All our approaches and each and every bit of AgTech we think we can use has to be nuanced. Nuanced to the geography, the culture, the food heritage, as Dan just pointed out. And they need evolution. It's not necessarily we have to come with a very, very radical approach and just change the way we eat. But they can be evolved in a nuanced way so that there is more acceptance, the demand is not lost, and it's easy to build that market for AgTech, so to say, to have those consumers ready to accept. And I think that will also help policymakers, because as everyone knows and is in the news, we've seen farmers in France, in Wales, coming up in arms against the policies that are trying to make farming more more sustainable, but it's not working. And why is that so? If we look into the very finer details, we'll understand that resistance comes from what they're used to versus what they have been told. There is hardly any proper meaningful communication going to them to really show the value, the long-term value of where they are falling short now and where they can head towards. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach, finally speaking. If we take the UK into perspective, say, for example, hypothetically speaking, if we have DESNZ, which is the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, DEFRA, and say, for example, the Department of Health and Social Care working together to come up with the policies which will essentially improve the health of the nation, at the same time ensure that we have food security, we would have an ideal system. But then again, this is utopia if you look at how governments work. But it is absolutely possible, and it has happened in other parts of the world, in other analogous areas. For example, I can cite an example from China, where they were trying, or rather struggling, to boost their automobile recycling, so to say, where the old cars were reclaimed, but they were not put into good use because of policy differences. So, for example, the good parts in automobiles were not used for new cars because they had regulatory roadblocks there. So the government there was able to bring the two departments, say the recycling industry and the regulatory side of the ministry, together to come and make those changes, so that then those automobile parts could be used for remanufacturing of automobiles. And that shot the remanufactured automobile industry to the roof. So this is just an example to cite that can also be transferred to the agri-tech and food area. But it's a matter of that will, and I'm sure people here, if they think that they can surely play an important part in that, will make the difference.
I see. And in fact, yeah, I think I'd like to really get into sort of thinking about some of the case studies, some of the more sustainable practices, technologies, and innovations that really have the potential to transform the current food system and address some of the issues that we talked about, right? Both on the production side, whether it's soil degradation, food waste, erosion, to the impacts on the consumption side. So as you've cited, the health impacts, right? So I think in terms of innovations broadly, I'm seeing kind of two frontiers. One is focusing more on how to make the current agriculture and farming practices more sustainable. And the other is kind of leveraging cutting edge science and technology to really explore novel or kind of revolutionary ways of food production to meet that future demand as a consequence of populations rising. So I'd like to start with the former part and just focusing on some of the novel science-based solutions that are driving innovation within food systems. And perhaps, Corinne, what do you think are the most promising developments within this space, and kind of ultimately what problems are these solutions trying to solve?
So I would be not a very good CEO of Meatable if I would not say that cultivated meat is one of the developments I think on the forefront. I do need to say that, especially on the production side, it's even what we are doing as an industry is a drop in the bucket. So I think here it's really we need all the different technologies to come together to even make a small dent into the system, just because it's so large. If you look at our own models, not even into the 2030s, but into the 2040s, you can even think about sort of double-digit market share numbers if we are sort of very aggressive in our scaling. So I think that's one important note to make. I do think that something like cultivating, we all know that meat is one of the biggest inefficiencies in the system. If you really talk about feeding the world, it's very inefficient to go through an animal, especially if it's a cow. After that, if it's a pig, because they're just very inefficient in sort of how they transfer plant-based materials into meat. So I think that's what we are doing is really on the forefront there. But like I said, it's just a drop in the bucket. I think other cool stuff I think is also going to happen on the gene editing side of things. I think that has been something that could not be spoken about. I think in Europe it's still an issue. I expect in sort of the next 5 to 10 years that it will be that paradigm will shift, and that people will see it as much more positive. Just to name two there.
Daniel, I saw you smiling there. Do you want to add something?
Yeah. I really like the opening presentation from the chairman of ILI, because he really talked about how 80% of their coffee comes from regenerative agricultural farms, right? So for me, that's a really, really interesting case, in which also he talks about how their best quality coffee comes from those farms. And we see that with our own production. Because I don't think that anybody wants their food to taste like tech, right? So and talking about efficiency, we need to talk about basically the food production system that we have today was basically built solely on that, and completely disregarding the nutrition aspect. And I think that, so we for instance spend a lot of time thinking about how our operations connect to the local environments in terms of the culinary scene. We work very close with chefs. We work very close with local communities. When they go to our farms and they see, I don't know how many people here have ever seen a live shrimp in their lives, right? It's very interesting, and I think that we need to get that connection with our food. I think that we have these very weird emotions when we are talking about food that can only be reconnected if we see how it is produced, right? So we focus a lot on that, and also about how can we get other efficiencies. Like for instance, we work with data centers because they produce excess heat, and in order to farm shrimp in Indianapolis, we need to invest in heating the water, right? Shrimp is a tropical animal. But we also think about in the downstream the value chain. Like for instance, we create excess biomass, and now our farms are leading basically regenerative agricultural transitions. So I don't think that I don't think that food tech is like any other tech, because it's not. It's a very complex interaction that it will have, and I think that we'll need to take it step by step.
I see. And what about the agricultural practices of today? What about the farming of today? How do we how do we make sure that these improve? Obviously, we talked about kind of the frontier technologies, but there's also a lot to be done in terms of regenerative agriculture, ensuring that carbon emissions come down for the farming sector, digitalization, and there's obviously a lot of talk about AI and generative AI and how this can ultimately have an impact in every sector. So Sharon, I'm wondering what do you think has the most potential to be deployed across the current farming and agricultural practices?
So as I said before, I think we have so many different solutions, and it's really about looking at where you are. And nuance was the word I couldn't remember from before, but it's looking at where you are and then deploying the right solution, because a place like Singapore is not the United States. Singapore will have to use technology, a lot of technology, to be food secure. It doesn't have like a lot of land to cultivate anything, right? But let's say on the agriculture side, obviously precision agriculture, controlled environment agriculture, but also looking at regenerative agriculture, I think what they all have in common is policies. And if we don't really understand that who we're talking to, farmers, and B, creating policies that work for them, and we will not go anywhere. So yes, agriculture is the less digitalized sector out there, and so if we are not investing in teaching farmers how to use drones and satellite imagery, we can't expect them to be positively receiving all this new information and not being afraid of automation or robotics or anything that is out there that is so far away from what they're accustomed to. And obviously incentivizing, for example, regenerative agriculture. We have to create a model where farmers will not feel that they're losing their livelihoods or putting, like in changing the way they go from a yield intensive crop production to a completely different one, where for sure in the first couple of years they're not going to be able to produce the same amount of food that they were producing before. So there's a lot of, I think, nuances that we need to think about. And we've seen all the protests here in Europe, for example, and we're seeing what is happening also in the US, South America, for example, with the cultivated meat bans. But the conversation has never put the farmer in the center, and it has to, because at the end of the day, it's really about, for example, using all the arable land that we are currently using for livestock feed, using it in more positive way, cutting down less trees. And some countries like Singapore will need to use technologies like that. And farmers should be able to diversify. I currently live in Italy, floods, drought. There are so many disasters that, put farmers way in trouble. And technology can be helpful for that if they were to diversify, if we were to take the time to tell them that it's okay to create more ways to make money, right?
Yeah. And how much of this, though, is kind of geography specific, context specific? For example, I have a dear friend who works on a farm between Argentina and Brazil, and he produces soybeans. And obviously, we talked about all the kind of digital assets, drones, but they're not thinking about that, and their margins are so kind of small that any investment into this is, I would say, to some extent prohibitive. So what are the solutions for countries that are not the developed countries in the European Union, for example? Sourav, I know you pointed out how the response needs to be nuanced and geography specific. So
Sure.
Perhaps you can elaborate on that.
Absolutely. So I'll just probably expand that with an example. So when we were young and growing up in a place where what is now known as aquaponics, where you grow fish and vegetables alongside. This has been there since ages, for thousands of years in Asian countries where you grow rice and fish, shrimp included, crabs, climbing perch fish, if anyone knows that. So these grow alongside the rice crop. So their manure fertilizes the rice crop. They eat the pests. As a young or a teenager, we used to go and fish those from the rice fields. Now, in the recent 20 years or so, every other year or a few years, we hear that 50 odd or 100 odd children have died or in hospital because they have gone and fished those fishes. They're still there, but the amount of pesticides and herbicides we're using are killing human beings now. So anytime I go and try and buy something from a local market, I'll have to ask them, does it come from a paddy field or does it come from a pond or a lake or whatever it is? So this is an example of where something that could have been translated into modern technology more fruitfully has gone wrong. And this is where the biggest gap in developing world is, the lack of investment in training and education, which is where the farmers need to be educated and taught as to what the implications of what they're doing now with the intensive agriculture is. And there's hardly any investment in that. The government is doing what it is trying to do, but as you can understand, there are layers of different parties having more control in certain regions of the country where they won't allow, what the central government wants as far as developmental programs are concerned to go into the population. So there are various regional and global issues that will stop these kind of things. So from Center for Big Synergy, we try and educate farmers primarily around these areas, because smallholding farmers don't see their piece of land as an enterprise. They still see that something to live off. We try and encourage them to understand what they can do with it, where they can produce more, where they can ensure food security, not just for themselves, but also for their neighbors, for example. And if they can have a certain level of sustainability with that, they're at least in a position to think beyond that, to have a little bit of cash for something else. It has been a very difficult journey for many farmers, and for some families who have now moved on from farming, their land is just lying there doing nothing. So I can tell you about 10 to 15% of land is still fallow. Proper arable land is fallow because families have moved on. It is no longer profitable to do smallholding farming. Children have gone on to do other jobs. They're no longer interested in farming. So there's a huge gap. It's not necessarily the stats that we see that we need so much more of arable land to feed the growing population. Not necessarily so. You have to look at these finer details that I just pointed out to see where land can be used. Can it be used as a cooperative, the entire village who are smallholder farmers? Can they lease their land to a corporation who can then grow in more modern ways and obviously provide them with the food as well as cash? So these are sort of things that communities are working on, and I'm very happy that there are many new and very young entrepreneurs who've left high-paying jobs in cities to go back and who are actually putting together villages, small-holding villages, and they are coming up with such modern ways of farming, be it polyfarming or aquaponics, and that is making a considerable amount of change in the local community, not necessarily just with prosperity, with education. So they are building this whole ecosystem. So provident funds, insurance, they go healthcare, education for children. So they are actually able to infiltrate into this entire ecosystem that supports farming families. So that is a good start. But as I said, there is a huge amount of work to be done, and there are quite a lot of opportunities as far as the global north investing in such projects, provided the government de-risks them, and that's something probably a huge agenda at the moment. But there is more than ample to ensure food security for the developing world as well as the developed world.
That makes perfect sense. In fact, I'd like to connect to a point you made about kind of lack of investment in kind of in knowledge for farmers to kind of improve their processes and become more efficient. I'd like to hear kind of some of the other challenges particularly to scale some of these new technologies that are being flawed. Particularly, Daniel, I'd like to hear from you in terms of how difficult it is to scale up what you're trying to achieve, and some of the solutions, whether it's from a public policy perspective, other stakeholders who can play a role to try and scale up some of these technologies.
Yeah, for instance, I tend to criticize a lot the current food system. But there are things that the current food system was very successful at doing it, right? And one of those is getting to scale. Like, for instance, the poultry business. There was no poultry industry in the 60s and the 70s. So in the 70s it started, 60s and 70s it started, and now it's the most popular protein in the world. Why? Because they developed this system that is called contract farming. So 98% of the production that a company like Tyson sells, they didn't grow it. They rely on a federation of farmers, it's called contract farming, that they invest their equity for building the infrastructure, and then Tyson helps them in getting their business and also going to market. So I think that we can also learn from what has previous companies have done right in the past. Of course, we need to change how humanely we treat, in this case, animals, right? The environmental aspect of it, and we need to also change it with new technologies. And I think that the answer for basically getting farmers on board, it's quite simple: profit. I mean, farmers really understand profits. They are like hedge fund managers because they work on so tiny margins that if you show them that something makes money, then they will take it on. So if some of our innovations are not particularly attractive for farmers, it probably doesn't really work a lot. So I don't think that, so technologists, we're not really known for being humble, but working in biotech and farming really makes you humble, because the more that we understand how nature works, the easier it is to see the scale of our blunder, right? In this case, like for instance, you're talking about the toxicity of these, we're running basically a huge chemical experiment on what we are doing. So we must basically bring the incentives together. And I think that one of the most important opportunities right now is consumer, because consumer wants, we don't want to basically to have a trade-off between having a great culinary experience, but also feeling good about our choices. So, and we are willing to pay more for it. So I think that profit and serving this new consumer is the way to go.
I have a couple more questions on this, but I'm, in the interest of time, keen to gather a few questions from the room. If there are any, there's a microphone will be coming around. Gentleman in front.
I didn't know you were going to ask me right away. Daniel, nice to meet you this morning. I'm David Bennell from the Investor Network TIFS, and I'm an investor myself. And I'm wondering what the panel feels about what we call at TIFS the missing middle of food systems investing. There's a lot of capital out here, and it's not being pulled through to the farmers, ranchers, fishers, the people we supposedly say we care about. What needs to change, Daniel, for you and Kieran, for you to get the kind of funding you need? What changes would you expect of us to make it easier to find you and to get money where it belongs? Thank you.
No, I think it's a good thing that investors are demand to see something, demand to see traction, and demand to see a business case, right? So in our case, basically, what I strive to do is to find the right business model and the right profitability profile, so that we can get to scale, basically by including others. I think that one thing that I would ask is to reconsider what we think is food tech, right? Because I think that we need to prioritize health, and we need to basically produce things that the market already wants, right? And then just fix how we supply it. So if investors are just more open to that definition of food tech, I think that would be good.
Yeah, maybe to add, so for me, the situation is different if you look at precision fermentation. I think there's sort of this gap between, on the one hand, you have the very early stage investment where it's still R&D, there's a lot of value created, so that's pretty easy to fund. And then at the other end, you have sort of the fully proven concept, the returns are clear, so you know what you're going to get for that investment. Then that sort of middle there, where you still have technical risk in the proposition, but you really need to build a facility which is not going to give you the 20-30% IRR. That's sort of, I think, where you see a lot of companies not making it. So I think that's for investors to really, I think there's an opportunity to understand that space better, and I think there's also an opportunity for governments to step in there as well.
If I may, one thing that is truly missing, I think, it's the infrastructure in general of having a food system that works. It's so siloed, and everybody just does their own thing, that until we start thinking as a system and build the infrastructure, we're just going to chase our own tails. Unfortunately. And you're laughing. Very honest.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for you today. Thank you very much for sharing your insights. Daniel, Sharon, Sourav, Corinne, thank you so much.